In fact, the hatred of democracy that was expressed in the last few months has absolutely no parallel that I know of. I mean, the countries that were praised, New Europe, the population was even more opposed to the war than in old Europe. But the leadership was willing to follow orders from Crawford, Texas, so that made them good guys. They had democratic credentials. They were following orders from us, but disregarding maybe 80 or 90% of the population. If there's ever been an expression of hatred of democracy like this in the past, I haven't seen it. And there's no certainty that Europe and Northeast Asia can be controlled. Asia is moving towards integration, what's called ASEAN +3, Southeast Asia plus the 3 industrial powers to the north are also moving in an independent direction. And this is if you look at a longer stretch of history, it's not at all surprising. I go back a couple hundred years, and the major commercial and industrial centers of the world were East Asia, South and East Asia, India and China, Japan, even Japan. But this sense kind of reconstructing, and the United States doesn't like it at all. For example, if Northeast Asia becomes integrated in terms of energy resources, so pipelines from Siberia to China and Japan, maybe through North Korea into South Korea, it'll have much less dependence on Middle East oil. The U.S. wants to control Middle East oil as a lever of world control. It's not that the U.S. needs the oil, probably doesn't, but it wants to control it. It wants to make sure that 50 years ago, George Kennan, top planner, said that control over Middle East oil gives us veto power over Japan's potential, at that time, potential industrial and military actions. They didn't take it seriously, but could happen. And control over Middle East oil and over the pipelines gives the United States, the transatlantic, the shipping lanes, that gives the U.S. Very significant control over the countries of the region, but not if they develop their own integrated resource-based industrial development, which is right on the horizon. And it's just as in Europe. So it's not simply a matter of controlling the population of the United States. Controlling the world is not an easy matter. I mean, North Korea is a pretty crazy place, but they're making it reasonably clear that they would trade security guarantees for a reduction of their very threatening military development. That would mean a security guarantee from the, what they're asking for isn't that crazy. A non-aggression agreement from the United States, economic assistance, all of that makes sense, and it's a way of maybe moving towards slowly integrating North Korea into the region in a healthier fashion, leading, one hopes, to changes internally which will open the place up politically and economically and so on. It's a long process, but that's the way to do it. The alternative is pretty frightening. Recent task force just published a study called The Road to Perdition, headed by Zelig Harrison, well-known Asia specialist. The confrontational policy, they say, is a road to perdition. It's going to lead to disaster. But there are possibilities for diplomatic, economic initiatives, kind of sunshine policy initiatives, which are not without prospects and certainly should be pursued. And it's striking that the United States is taking a different stand from the regional countries in this respect. Not totally, but different. And I suspect that a lot of what lies behind it is the concern that if there is a peaceful diplomatic settlement, it will be a spur towards integration. I mean, North Korea isn't that important geopolitically, but it's not of null importance either. I mean, gas pipelines and extension of the Trans-Siberian Railroad through North Korea into the south would be another step towards bringing the region into closer integration as a tying together its resource base and its industrial capacity. And I think the United States is not happy about that prospect. Meanwhile, the U.S. is shifting its military basing system from Central Europe towards the Middle East and Central Asia. So bases are moving from Germany to Bulgaria and Romania. The U.S., one of the main results of the Afghan war from the U.S.'s point of view, probably the major result, is that the U.S. ends up with a strong military position in Central Asia, which is a benefit to U.S. corporations in the so-called great game as to who controls its resources, but also, more important than that, help surround the far more significant Persian Gulf energy system, which is the main one in the world. The U.S. basing system, military basing system from Okinawa and Guam up to the Azores has been focused to a large extent on the Middle East. And the same is true of the Central European ones. Now that's moving closer to the region. Until the Afghan war, the U.S. had only one reliable military base near the Persian Gulf, namely the British island of Diego Garcia. The population was kicked out. The British courts ordered the government to allow them to return, but the U.S. just refused, said won't. So that's a military base, but that's a small base in the middle of the ocean. Now they've got bases in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, and probably pretty soon in Iraq, surrounding ones in Eastern Europe. It's moving towards the region that's of crucial significance for strategic domination of the world. I hate to talk about Japan. People know a lot more about it than I do. But Japan, it's pretty clear from observing from a distance that there's a kind of a split developing. And the policy is moving in a rightward militaristic direction. On the other hand, the population is clearly much more open and free than it was before. For example, discussions like this 5 or 10 years ago in Japan would have been very unlikely. I should say I've been visiting Japan for 40 years now, and until recently, it was the only country in the world. I travel in a lot of countries. It's the only one where I was never asked to give political talks or have political interviews. I have plenty of interviews, but they're on professional topics and professional talks and so on. That's changed a lot in the last couple of years. So that's, from what it looks like to me, one direction. On the other hand, if you look at policies, it's going in the other direction, which is like the United States. The United States is much more open than it was a couple of years ago. Huge audiences, tremendous demand, and so on. On the other hand, policy is shifting so far to the right that positions that were regarded as outlandish a couple of years ago are right in the middle of the spectrum today. Well, what we were talking about. I mean, the populations of the world, in my opinion at least, are becoming much more civilized, much more concerned about things, looking into issues seriously, acting about them. I mean, there's very important developments in the world which we haven't discussed, like the opposition to the war in Iraq is completely without precedent. There has never, in history of Europe and the United States at least, been such massive protest against a war before it was launched. It takes years usually. The global justice movements are, again, have no precedent. They're international. There's a lot of international solidarity, North-South solidarity. They're dedicated to serious issues. They're working hard. I mean, these are very promising developments. I mean, basically, there are two trajectories in the world. There's one towards war, destruction, repression, demolition of progressive achievements, and so on. That's very clear. There's another that's going quite in the opposite direction. And it's just a question which one will prevail. we're not going to have a lot of time to answer that question. The survival of the species is a fragile matter at this point. Somebody, again, observing this from Mars would not put very high odds on human survival.
So it's up to us to make it happen.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.